Hello there, Steve. Welcome back to Sydney.
Good to be here.
Okay, so we'll just head straight into the questions. Mr. Scalpel, Scott Morrison, claims the property market is in for a soft landing, not a crash. So there's regulators targeting interest-only loans, helping the first-time home buyers with stamp duty. How is this gentle collaboration going to work?
Well, there hasn't been a property market on the planet that's had a soft landing. So whenever there's been a crash, it's been a substantial fall in house prices. They may bounce afterwards, but they fall of the order of, there's like in America's case, they fell 40% before they recovered about 20-25%. So good luck to being the first one to engineer it. The really distinguished thing about the Australian property market is the extent to which the government's willing to continue pumping it up. And this reflects a long history of politicians finding out by practice that pumping up the property market works to make them look good as economic managers, but not quite knowing why. So it began with Keating back in the late 80s, when he was persuaded to bring in what was then called the First Home Owners Scheme. And I think it was originally $3,000. And that set off a bubble in 88, just after the stock market crash in 87, which gave us a booming economy until 1990, when it crashed because the level of leverage that households took on exceeded their capacity to finance, and particularly as interest rates went through the roof at the same time in an attempt to control inflation, largely reflecting what was happening with Hawke in America. And the economy crashed because it went from a boom to a crash. And the reason for the boom and the reason for the crash is that when people borrow money and spend it into the economy, whether they're buying goods and services or they're buying assets, that's increasing demand in the economy. And that increase in demand becomes based upon that level of credit, the level of new borrowing continuing to rise. As soon as it stops rising, it falls over. And this is what they believe they can engineer a soft landing. It's a bit like if you imagine you're jumping onto a cliff, then what your cliff itself is the level of private debt compared to GDP. So what they imagine is they're going to go up for a while. They don't know that's the cause, by the way, but this is the actual cliff. Imagine you go up for a while, and then you reach a peak, and then it goes horizontal. And therefore, if you want to jump onto a horizontal thing, that's easy to do. You can make the soft landing. The reality is that even if you did stabilise the level of debt, so the ratio of debt to GDP didn't change, it went horizontal. At that point, you've got a drop in demand. So you think you're jumping onto a cliff, you're actually jumping off the other side of a mountain. Credit demand collapses and down it comes. That said, and we'll talk about in more detail about what the logic is behind that anyway. That said, the Australian government's capacity to and desire to keep the property market bubble going exceeds that of any other country government on the planet, including Ireland. I mention Ireland because Ireland is the only other country running a substantial trade deficit that has reached a level of household debt similar to Australia's. They peaked at about 120% of GDP as their peak level back in about 2010. We exceeded that about 2 years ago, 1 or 2 years ago. We're now at 123% on the last figures of household debt to GDP. So we've become the world leader in leveraging up the household sector, which is an explanation as to why we have one of the world's highest house prices as well.
So in terms of this, the policies of interest only, targeting the interest only loans, is that going to have any effect?
Yeah, because interest only loans work for both the lender and the borrower, so long as house prices continue rising.
Yep.
Now, if you suddenly have house prices heading in the other direction, then it's not worth it. The only reason the person's take an interest-only loan is to get as large amount of capital as they can to ride that appreciation. If the appreciation ends, they've no longer got any real interest. They're losing money. They're paying out the interest. They're watching an asset fall. If they sell, they know they're going to lose money out of it. And at the same time, the level of spending that they're actually doing to finance it is something, if you look at principal versus principal plus amortization, paying interest plus paying principal, it's about 40% difference. So if that actually is put into place, they go from being able to cope with the cost of maintaining their loan to being wiped out and having to shut it down. So it's an incredibly fragile way to maintain the bubble. And it's rather similar to what the Japanese did with 99-year loans.
So cash rate is at 1.5%. What is the major concerns with maintaining this low interest rate environment?
Well, I think there's no problem in maintaining it because there's absolutely no chance of increasing it. And the reason is that people think rates like this are unprecedented. Sure, they're unprecedented if you ignore the 1950s and 60s. That's when the rates were at the same level, but at that stage, the level of household debt was 1/6 of what it is now. And my parents had bought a property at that time through the Commonwealth Bank, so they're paying low interest rates again. They work for the Commonwealth Bank. They were, as my mother said last night, we didn't even notice the payments. Now, paying 5% now, you notice the payments because the level of debt is 6 times what it was. Actually, arguably, when you look at mortgage loan, it could be 12 times as high. So the level of debt servicing is that much higher. Now, because economists and politicians don't understand credit, they think that it's all a case of, well, can the households that have borrowed the money sustain repayment? They don't think, can the households continue borrowing more money? They think the important question is they can service the debt they've got. Yeah, that means they don't go insolvent, but unless they're borrowing more money, the demand disappears. So this is the whole dependent upon increasing level of debt indefinitely. And having got to 123% of GDP as our household debt level, the only way to maintain the house prices as they are is to continue that rising. And once we hit 140%, we're in complete world record territory. The only country that had that high level of household debt was Denmark, and that was running a huge trade surplus. It still is. So that's the only country we've got left to exceed on the bar Switzerland. Switzerland's also a trade surplus country with about, I think, 128% of household debt to GDP. So we're relying upon being able to get into territory nowhere's ever been before to sustain a bubble that's the biggest one on the planet.
Yeah. I heard recently this interesting point about having this low interest rate environment actually pushes forward the age of automation. So you got a factory, you got a high labour cost, and you've got low interest rates. You're going to try and start pushing forward the age of automation. Do you think that's an important factor nowadays?
Not particularly, because the other thing which goes with this low interest rates is low wages and low wage growth. And a major factor, in fact, it can be seen as a reason why the Industrial Revolution took place in the UK rather than in Europe, is a high cost of labour. Because if you have a high cost of labour, then it's in your interest to develop labour-saving technology. And that's what happened with steam and happened with the spinning jenny and things like that in the UK. A very good economic historian who's done the numbers on France at the same time versus the UK, and it turns out the wages in France were that much lower for textile workers that the spinning jenny wouldn't have been a worthwhile invention in France, whereas it was a worthwhile invention in UK. So paradoxically, high wages can actually encourage technological innovation. And these sorts of indirect factors are what people don't normally think about. With low interest rates, and you've also got low wages, you're basically grabbing as much of the surplus as you can for yourself without giving very little of it to the workers. Why bother automating? In fact, you're likely to go backwards. And when I look at what's happening in the UK, that seems to be the story. So I don't think the interest rates play a role in the automation. It's still happening, but I don't think they're an encouraging factor. In fact, the level of corporate debt is so high that corporations themselves aren't particularly investing in the technology. With a lower level of corporate debt and potentially higher interest rates, we could actually have more innovation going on.
Absolutely. Deloitte recently announced that Australia is sitting on a powder keg should the rates rise. So I would say that you're inclined to agree with them.
I'm inclined to agree with them, but the rate rises will only happen because the Reserve Bank might as well have buried itself in a 1970s textbook or 80s textbook for a level of appreciation of the economy itself. And they are likely to put up rates because, remember, they were the only central bank to increase interest rates after the global financial crisis. They were the very last one to start cutting rates when they realised, oh dear, something's happened we weren't expecting. Then they've restarted the bubble by dropping the rates and hoping that encourage a housing bubble of sorts, but nothing like the scale they've helped to encourage with the level of investor loans that have taken place and letting things like no principal repayment loans develop as well as another case of massive regulatory oversight. So they are likely to try putting up rates, perhaps that they believe inflation is coming along, and be forced to go in reverse direction again when the economy tanks far more than they expect.
Could we have avoided a crisis if CPI was included? If CPI included house prices as a weighted factor of consumer spending?
Well, yeah. If what we have is inflation that has occurred has been entirely in the price of assets, and assets are much, much more. The people make this old Milton Friedman line about, inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. It's not particularly true in the goods market. What really causes inflation there is wage rises exceeding labour productivity, which is a good thing because that actually is part of the redistribution mechanism of capitalism. But what it really does apply is in asset markets. If you're throwing lots and lots of money at asset markets, then prices are incredibly flexible and volatile in asset markets, and they'll rise. And that's what's been happening with the amount of money being pumped into the property market. Now, because economic theory hermetically seals finance from economics, and the people who go to the RBA have not had the education in the real world that people in the Bank of England have had, or even the Bundesbank, and they've woken up to the nature of the monetary system far more so than the Reserve Bank has done thus far. But if we'd actually realised, okay, well, you can't separate economics and finance. You've got to have an amalgam. You must look at the asset markets and the goods and services markets together. In that environment, then you have to have an indicator which covers all of them. And the simple CBI doesn't even touch the asset markets, which is where most of the monetary demand effects end up occurring. So if we had indicators which said we have to look at the level of asset price inflation and worry about that, in the same way as we worry about the level of consumer price inflation, we would have a more sensible economic management.
Have you gone to any of the central banks about this subject, and what have there been responses, if any?
Oh, the Bank of England's been fantastic. The Bank of England, when you speak to even the most conventional modelers inside the Bank of England, will admit that they didn't see the crisis coming. They got it completely wrong. They thought their models described capitalism accurately, and what happened in 2008 took them completely by surprise, and they were in shock, and they know that they have to learn and do something different. And that's something you can get from high-up officials in the Bank of England. And they're therefore very willing to invite in rebels like myself. I've been to about a dozen functions at the Bank of England. I've spoken 3 or 4 times there, writing research papers with one of them, one of the chief economic advisors, one of my best friends. It's very, very open. And I've also spoken in the Statistics Norway, the Bank of Norway. The Bank of Norway's come out also saying banks create money against the religion of the mainstream that they don't create money. Even the Bundesbank has come out. So mainly I've spoken to lots of central banks in third world countries, so Argentina, Turkey, Malaysia, a few of the ones I've spoken at, and then they're more open as well. But you are finding places like the Bundesbank, Bank of England, Bank of Norway, realising that what they were taught in universities does not describe capitalism at all. And because they've been charged with a major responsibility for managing capitalism, they've got to be open to ideas that are more realistic. So the central banks are my hope for the world, with the sole exception of the RBA.
So the economy has been dragging along for the past 10 years. With fairly okay-ish real estate growth and without any major correction. Why can't it just drag on for another 10 years?
It can. Well, it's one of the major factors that's in its advantage that didn't happen earlier, of course, is overseas buying, particularly Chinese buying. And there's very good reasons why Chinese people would want to buy here. We're looking at if you're picking up anything of the blue sky behind me. One of my recent trips to China, I was greeted at the airport by my people who were taking me for the workshop that I was running, and they said, "Welcome to an APEC blue sky." APEC meaning the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. And at the time of the meeting, the Chinese government told all factories around Beijing to shut down for 2 weeks, so the sky was blue. So you can't blame blue sky in China for love or money, though I must say I've seen a dramatic drop in pollution in the last 2 years, so they are having an impact. They will turn it around. But at the moment, you want blue sky, you've got to buy somewhere else. We're on almost the same time zone as China, so there's no jet lag issues to worry about. And a lot of Chinese people want a less, even though in my opinion, we've just badly damaged the education system in Australia with all the neoliberal nonsense that's been imposed on both universities and schools in the last 20 or 30 years. It's still less rote learning than tends to apply in a lot of Chinese. So they want to come out and get a more progressive education for their kids. All good reasons to do it. But of course, we're talking about a country with 1.4 billion people, where the standard of living is at least on average half what it is in Australia, I would say. I've looked around a few cities in China, and therefore many, many millions of people who could afford to buy property here. So there's another way that the government can extend the bubble by extending foreign ownership and letting that continue on, and they will do everything to get the bubble going.
Just this is a little off our questions, but I've been recently looking at the history of China, and the history of China is like a revolution after a revolution after a revolution. Do you see this happening with China now, or have they stabilized as a
No, I
government?
think that's a real danger because China, what would happen in China, because you're managing a country of 1.4 billion people, okay, and it's very easy to get a slogan that you drive on, and the slogan pushes development. Everybody hits behind the slogan because there's such a strong central government. Push the slogan too far and the thing falls over. And in that sense, what actually got China through the financial crisis, people don't remember that when the crisis hit, it took China by surprise as much as anybody else. And China's exports to the West fall by something in the order of 40% in very rapid order between 2007 and 2009. And there was a massive demigration of people from the cities back to the country again, because a lot of the people working in factories in the coastal cities don't have living permits to live in those cities. So they can only stay there so long as they're working in a factory. When the factory got shut down or reduced orders dramatically because of the decline in export demand, there was a massive migration of people back to the countryside. They weren't happy. And there's more political sensitivity, ironically, in that political system to what the working class and the poor want than there is in this system. Very much better at fobbing us off in the West than they are in China. So with that, you put huge political pressure on the Chinese to do something, and what they did was basically told their banking system, which is largely state, if not state-owned, then state-dominated, to lend to anybody with a pulse. And what you had was an enormous building boom. You also had huge infrastructure spending. You had all the money that's now going into pollution repair, so it's not all just a property bubble, but a huge part of it was an enormous property bubble, overbuilding. That is coming to an end now, and China has had the biggest increase in private debt in the history of capitalism. So what took, for example, in Japan's case, what took Japan roughly 20 years to increase its level of private debt to GDP, China did in 8. So that has to stop. And when it does stop, of course, that demand disappears, and then in that situation you have a decline in demand, which will cause another turnaround. But the fear in China is always of that potential for breakup. Because there are, I think there's about 14 or so major provinces. There's always a worry you're going to go back to the warlord situation. But the centre will turn that around. Right. I do. But it's not going to be pretty.
Yeah. Well, recently they've been putting out a lot of anti-corruption laws, and then they're actually stopping all the capital, like cash flow, outside of the country. They're making it a bit difficult for foreign residents in the country as well. So they're starting to create a bit more of an isolationist policy.
Yeah, there's the extent to which he seems more Stalinist in his style than previous leaders have been since Mao, and he's certainly the strongest since Mao. And that's the feeling that I get when I'm in China. There's very further dominance being asserted because in some ways you've got such powerful forces. You've got to have a strong man. I mean, this is one thing which the West doesn't appreciate with all the stupid interventions it's done in the third world and particularly in the Arabian area, that often it takes a strong man to hold these sorts of unidirectional policies together for some length of time. The trouble is when it breaks down, you've got to then be able to switch horses, and there's no guarantee they can do it.
Yeah. So I want to go over to something which probably isn't quite your forte, architecture. Now,
I had a couple of goes at a piece of architecture I saw in Melbourne a couple of days ago on Twitter, you may have noticed.
So, since I like all the old architecture buildings, and I like buildings to look very homely, flowers outside, those kind of things. Now, whereby all these new property estates get built up now, they're very blocky and they've got that one-tone colour. What do you think of that look and that design? Oh,
it makes the area potentially ugly. I mean, there's something about architecture. You want architecture to make the environment look attractive. I remember being in Romania. I spent a fair too much time in Romania at one stage of my life, and working out in one of the gyms there, having a chat to one of the young kids there, and saying, what do you want to do? So I want to leave Romania. I said, why? I said, who wants to live in as ugly as this? Now, the reason he called it ugly was that Ceausescu, when after the Second World War, a major drive was to put housing up, and basically all these ugly blocks went up parallel to each other, 20 metres apart, 10 stories high type stuff. Crappy ideas about socialised food as well in the middle of all of them. But the reality, it really was an ugly city.
Yeah.
And you want architecture to be something which is pleasing to the eye, not confronting.
Do you think that's like a marker of our legacy to the future generations?
Well, it's going to be in the same way. The 1890s was the last really major housing boom and bubble in Australia. And that was back in the times of the Victorian era. And of course, Australia was still obviously the English colony at the time, quite literally and legally. And what happened with the gold boom set it all off. Then there was a property bubble largely focused in Melbourne. And if you go around Melbourne today, you'll see all these grand old buildings, which look quite good to the eye, because they were trying to emulate the regal architecture of the UK. So that was their legacy. Now, we actually benefit from that. Now, this stuff is sort of postmodernist, confronting concrete crap.
Yeah.
And when the future generation says, what the hell were they thinking when they put that load of shit up? And so in some ways, rather than a legacy which would make you like enjoy the old period and happy to go along to a fancy dress ball at the Carlton Town Hall, this place, you'd rather jump off one of the balconies.
All right, so come the next crisis, James Rickards has talked about a ICE 9 event. And yeah, so this is where there's a partial closure of bank accounts, there's like minimal with cash withdrawals, and there's a conversion of the IMF's, or to the IMF's SDR currency, special drawing rights, as they have the only clean balance sheet left. How would this scenario play out and compare against a debt jubilee?
No, I don't agree with James on that front. Okay. James is a guy who believes gold is money.
Yep.
I believe gold is a speculative commodity that does well during financial crises, but it's not money.
Yep.
I'm not a fan of floating exchange rates. I think we should have a Bancor system like Keynes proposed some time ago. And the reason the IMF has a clean balance sheet is that it's like a supranational version of a national government, which can create as much money as it likes. Yep. It puts a liability on one side of its account and asset on the other, and it gets away with that as a money creation system for the simple reason that a central bank can operate with negative equity, whereas any private bank that gets negative equity goes bankrupt. So that idea of a clean balance sheet, it's actually because there is no limitation on assets minus liabilities having to be positive. So I don't see that as a realistic scenario from James.
Okay, so you don't think there's no chance of that ever playing out, the lockdown of the accounts?
No, no. I mean, that's only happened in Cyprus.
Yeah.
And it's happened because, as much as I'm critical of the RBA, I'm more critical of the ECB.
Right.
For imposing the nonsense of an auto-liberal economic philosophy on Europe, which presumes we can all save money. Right. Now, one thing I've been trying to explain to people in some of my more recent podcasts, and developing this as a new way of modelling money dynamics as well, is that savings at the individual level reduces income at the aggregate level. It's a one-for-one relationship. If you have an individual who decides to save money, that means they spend less. Because they spend less, the income they generate for other people falls. So there's an identity between your savings and a fall in income for the rest. Now, if you have a supranational system like the European Eurozone, which says we're all trying to run a surplus, then you're all trying to reduce what you generate as income for everybody else. So your policy is to reduce income to zero. Yeah. Now, that's the real danger. Now, that only happened because the European Central Bank controls all the central banks of those countries. If Cyprus had its own central bank and printed its own notes, that could never have happened. So to have the sort of breakdown James is presuming can occur, and I like James, by the way, and I like a lot of his argument, but I disagree with him on those fundamental issues. It would require the banks to cease being able to issue their own money. Now, central banks can always issue as much of their own money as they like, which is where QE has come from.
Yeah. So, on our previous interview, you talked about utilising the free energy. Now, Dick Smith thinks that Australia should go nuclear to reduce its huge energy bills. Where do you stand on this matter?
Okay. The whole idea about energy is that what we actually are, we see ourselves as having worker versus capitalist struggle. That's still the mindset we've got. Do the workers exploit the capitalists, which is the Austrian point of view? Do the capitalists exploit the workers, which is the Marxist point of view? They're both wrong. The reality, we're collectively exploiting the energy we find on the planet and in the sky. And that's where we're basically mining energy, and that's what we turn into goods and services, and that's where our wealth has come from. And if we got our heads around that, we'd have a very different social system, and actually in some ways less social conflict than we have right now. But what Australia has done is not actually turn that energy that it has huge amounts of into a means of building its own industry. Now, on the nuclear issue, I don't know, I mean, again, Dick is somebody that I've met and I like a lot of his arguments on the population Ponzi and so on. I hope he means thorium-based nuclear power,
Right.
not uranium, because we have never mastered the technology in uranium. The danger that most people are aware of with uranium reactors is, of course, they can have meltdowns because you have a spontaneous source of fission, which means that you've got to get the uranium close enough together for the U-235s to split and generate enough neutrons to cause other U-235s to split, and you have a controlled chain reaction, an inherently unstable process. Now, the very first reactor was based on thorium. You ever heard of what thorium is?
No news to me.
Okay, thorium is another, is a uranium level metal, but it only undergoes fission if it's bombarded by neutrons. So you have to have a beam of neutrons being projected out, which of course we can generate. And so long as the beam is in process, then that will cause enough thorium to fission and generate energy that way. And also the worst waste product that thorium generates, I think, has a half-life of 300 years.
Okay.
So if we went with thorium reactors, we're doing very nicely, thanks very much. Now, the technology wasn't developed for a very simple reason. You can't make nuclear weapons out of thorium.
Okay.
Now, therefore, we never developed the technology, but the knowledge is there. We could rebuild it. So if Dick means let's start doing that, I'm all in favour of it because, as it happens again, Australia's got one of the world's major reserves of thorium. So we could do it. But if he's talking nuclear and use uranium, no way.
Yeah, when you think about Australia, it's got the space for one, but then obviously you've got the distance of travelling, the
Well,
energy.
one thing we don't have is the information and the knowledge.
Yep.
This is what we've denigrated in the last 30 or 40 years. And one thing I'm promoting a lot, if I can right now, is work by a bunch of data scientists at Harvard University, which they call the Atlas of Economic Complexity. And what that explains is that it's not specialisation that gives you growth, it's diversity.
Yeah.
Okay, specialisation at the individual level makes sense, but collectively, to enable innovation to take place, you've got to have a diverse range of skills that you can combine into new industries and so on. You need a knowledge base, you need a web of knowledge. And what Australia's been doing systematically, at the behest of its economists who think they know what they're doing and they damn well don't, is reducing the complexity of that web that Australia has of knowledge that enables it to build new industries or to do things like build nuclear power stations. Now, we'd have to import all the bloody people to do that if we're going to give it a try in the first place. We simply don't have that knowledge anymore. We used to have it. And just to give you an idea of where we stand on complexity, this particular index that they've developed, which talks about both diversity and ubiquity of the products, and generates a scale that ends up being a very good indicator not just of high economic growth, but also whether you're likely to grow or shrink. We're below the line, which implies growth, where we're likely to have shrinkage in future. And our ranking of the complexity of the Australian economy is comparable to Jamaica and Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
Not exactly where we want to be.
Absolutely. So, old politicians, your Bob Hawkes, your John Howards, whether you liked them or hated them, you knew they took a stand and they would fight their case. Nowadays, politicians are caught up in opinion polls and trying to win the popularity contest. Where has Australians or the politicians lose their guts or backbone?
Well, I think Linton Crosby plays a certain major role in that, and I'm now glad to see him have egg on his face with Theresa May in the UK. It was all because of something which one of Maggie Thatcher's advisors put very succinctly. He said he wasn't going to be happy when there was a Conservative government in power. He'd be happy when there are two Conservative parties vying for power. So what you really had was the Labor Party in Australia being shaped into being, conservative light, with the idea we're going to be better managers. So we use the same economic textbook, we'll just do it better, and they're going to enjoy doing nasty stuff to you. We'll be sorry about doing nasty stuff to you, but it's all going to be for your good in the long run. And of course, that was believing that a first-year economic textbook told you how to manage the world, which unfortunately most economists believe. And when the politicians swallowed this stuff, the only difference between one party and another was how popular the leader was. Okay. Now, that was all based on a fallacy. The only reason you got growth across that whole period was that neoliberal philosophy let finance rip from 1/3 the size it is now to the level it is today, and the extra 2/3 are all basically parasitic rather than creative. But while you were borrowing the money and spending it, the economy boomed. So that's what actually they rode. They're not even aware that's what they rode to get to the top. We're on the other side of it now. And this is the funny thing, the politicians still think, the remnants of them still think it's all about being popular and being more attractive than the other and yada, yada, yada. Corbyn showed in incredible detail, now comes down to just saying we've got policies that take the situation of the majority of the population seriously. Trouble is that particular neoliberal consensus is still going to try to undermine those policies internally. They now dominate the state, and they're basically intent on destroying it.
Yeah. Well, when Donald Trump swept to power, whether, like, again, another example is somebody that you probably don't dislike, but at least you know where you stand with him. He's got that sort of opinion, and you're like, okay, well, he's going to go in that direction, and you almost you prefer those type of people, even if you dislike them. At least you know where you stand with them.
You think.
Yeah, but yeah, it's the whole horizon's just changed now, where it's just you've got the smiles, but in the end of the day, it's just not really. It's the policies made up by all these opinion polls. So I want us to look at a period in time in Australia in 1890s where there was a house price crash stroke depression. What are the comparisons between that age and today?
Oh, they're very, very high. In fact, there's one of the few papers in the Reserve Bank has published that I actually highly recommend reading is by Fisher and Kent, and it's called Two Depressions, One Banking Collapse. I think that's its title, A Tale of Two Depressions and One Banking Collapse. And it compares the Great Depression, 1930s, to the 1890s, and says, in fact, that the 1890s was a much worse crisis for Australia than the 1930s. And the reason was that there was a higher level of private debt in the 1890s than there was in the 1930s. It had all gone into leverage up asset prices. So it began with a real phenomenon, that was the gold rush. And then in the aftermath of the gold rush, all these grand buildings being created, and you had a housing bubble developing, building bubble and housing bubble developing, particularly in Melbourne. And because people were borrowing money and creating it, you had a huge spread of banks as well, which were, I don't know with actually many private banks, but there were wildcat private banks in the Australian economy at the time. They could print their own notes, and the notes were circulating to some degree inside the economy. So a huge economic stimulus that way. Mainly it was, state-backed, not state-backed, but state-regulated. But that huge increase in demand, and then it collapsed. So the basic mechanism that I emphasise is that total demand in the economy is the sum of the turnover of existing money, which is largely spent on GDP, plus new debt, which is credit, which is largely spent buying assets. So your total demand is the sum of the two. And with that situation, you can have a dramatic increase in demand coming out of this rise in debt. But equally, when the rise in debt goes in the other direction, when a change in debt starts to decline, that decline can be enough to cause you have a downturn, even if debt's still rising and if income is still rising. So it's this double whammy. We get caught by it by surprise. But that was so big in the 1890s. It was relatively minor for Australia in the 1930s. We've now got, I haven't actually done the figures recently, but we must have at least twice the level of private that we had back in the 1890s.
Yeah, and the scary thing is that I went through the newspapers there, and they talk about the anecdotal evidence of mothers begging and on the streets, like absolute chaos and depravity of what happened in those times. Could we end up facing that kind of situation?
No, because one of the big changes is the increase in the scale of government. Again, we tend to extrapolate backwards what we know about the world to what we think happened back then.
Yeah.
And if you look back in the 1890s, the government spending was about 1/3 what it is now. And even with the government trying to cut back on all its spending and all the ridiculous austerity that politicians here as well as the rest of the world fall for, government is still 3 or 4 times the scale of it was before the Great Depression.
Yeah.
And therefore, when there's a downturn in the private sector, there's necessarily an increase in government money creation. So you don't get as big a decline, but you still can get that. If you push full austerity like you do in Greece, then yes, you do get those depression levels and people committing suicide because they realise it's either starvation or a quick death.
Yeah.
But we don't necessarily face that because they're increasing the scale of government.
Right. So these times is a hotbed for extreme political ideologies to make traction. Where do you think the most traction is going to come from?
Oh, it's hard to say because what has political appeal is often xenophobia, unfortunately. We've got pretty good examples of it strength in Australia and with Trump as well. And then also what's happening with the refugee movement. So there's a pretty ugly side to that. There's no reason that the populist wave that takes over is going to be one any of us likes.
Yeah.
That certainly wasn't the case in the 1930s. So that's one of the dangers. I would hope that we'd realise the role of the monetary system in creating this, the role of excessive debt, and the fact that debt is not banks responsible for lending out somebody else's money, so if they don't pay it back, they're robbing somebody else. It's banks irresponsibly creating too much money for the wrong reasons, and therefore there's every reason to go and rewrite it. I would like to see a modern debt jubilee as a way out of this. But I think a combination of things, most likely xenophobia coming out of, particularly out of more refugee processes, partially caused by ridiculous Western wars in the Middle East, but also partly caused by climate collapse.
Yeah.
And that's more likely to be the popular one until such time as we realise why they're fleeing those parts of the world, which is the impact of climate change. And that more likely might ultimately lead to us finally doing something sensible and uniting against not a common enemy, but a common threat to our existence.
So I know this goes off our questions a bit, but do you think Australia, the arguments from like the extreme right is that if you wash the country with third world immigrants, you eventually are going to create a third world country, like where, and there's something defined as a Australian culture. Where do you stand with those kind of arguments?
Totally opposite. Because, I mean, people who are willing to hop on a boat and sail from Sri Lanka to here, the sort of people I want in the country. That's talk about courage and initiative. It's either they're normally leaving something appalling in their own. You don't do it because you get attracted by the possibility of welfare payments in Australia. You do it because you've got intolerable situations where you are and you want a better life for your family. And that's where a huge amount of initiative comes out of. A huge part of what gave England its boost in the Industrial Revolution were Huguenot refugees from Europe.
Yeah.
Exactly the same story. So it's completely the wrong way to read that sort of behaviour. And what you get, cultures are always elastic. People talk about being Anglo-Saxons. That doesn't mean they don't realise it means they're proud Germans. Because the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes were tribes that invaded England in the 700s and 800s. Yeah. So there's always a plasticity to culture. At the same time, if the culture itself has got some degree of welcoming its nature to the people who turn up, they absorb part of it and the culture continues on.
So, and then there's another argument with like just the economics of it. So politicians are trying to increase the GDP, and if you keep a good steady inflow of immigration, that's just going to naturally create that stat for you. And then the people that are on the ground say, these roads are just filling up, I can't go to hospitals.
Like this is what some of my friends call a population Ponzi. Yeah. And this is all to the benefit of the real estate lobby. Okay. They're the ones who benefit out of the rising house prices, far more so than individuals do. They think they're doing better because of more expensive houses. When they try to realise those gains, they realise it's only the developers who come out ahead and the real estate agents and the banks. But yeah, it's a population Ponzi. We have to look at the carrying capacity of this continent. We're already pretty close to reaching it, if not exceeding it, if you look at what's called the human ecological footprint. So there's good reason to say that we've got a maximum population we want to have. We're possibly exceeding it already, certainly getting close to that. And therefore our policy should be about the sustainability of the population, given our current resources and given the strain we're putting on the environment, and therefore go in the reverse direction. But I'd be getting rid of, what they call them, 471 visas. Yep. I'd be going for much more refugee intake on the balance and family reunion. Make it a socially oriented immigration policy rather than an economically oriented one, which is the typical thing that's being done right now, which is part of why workers aren't getting wage rises. And it's hilarious to see the RBA telling workers to demand for wage rises when the immigration policy is part of what's undermining it. Make it refugee-based and family-based and aim for a stabilised population or potentially even falling one.
Can I give you another sort of thing about the selective process of immigration control? So if you purely selected the most educated people and brought them into Australia, is that far better for the
No,
productivity?
you want to have training as well. I mean, one thing a lot of is it the 471 visa, is that what it's
Yeah,
called? A lot of that is just to avoid the need to train.
yeah.
Okay. Now, if you look at the German economy, you see a place which respects trade qualifications and has incredibly high quality apprenticeship training. And there's nothing wrong with saying you're going to be going as a skilled worker in a manufacturing plant. That's actually a quite respected, intellectually respected and well rewarded, relatively, career than what it is over here. And that involves training your own people and having an infrastructure to do the training. So you've got to build that up over time. I would be looking to bring over, well-educated and gifted individuals, but often it's simply the desire. There's no guarantee the well-educated people are going to be the ones who want to migrate here anyway. I mean, it's the ones who have the desperate need, are the ones who've got potential they can't fulfil where they are. They're the ones who end up being refugees half the time. So I'd rather rely upon self-selection on that front than trying to bias it.
So another window of history I think is quite interesting is after the World War II, Japan and Germany became global powerhouses. I know they're looking a bit shaky now, but what is the examples there of what happened, and could Australia make that kind of comeback?
Well, a major reason why that happened was all their debts were written off. All their private debts were written off. In the aftermath to a world war where you're being conquered, you don't enforce debt contracts anymore. So you start from a level where the money, the potential of the money supply to expand and finance demand is huge. Japan also had a huge demographic shift, people moving from the countryside to the cities, all of whom wanted to purchase goods and services. So there was a huge internal as well as external market for them to sell into. And you had an incredible pressure to innovate. So if you look at Honda, I think Honda began as a bicycle manufacturer. And then Mr. Honda attached a two-stroke or four-stroke motor to a bicycle frame, and you had the beginning of the Honda Motor Company. But you had to start from scratch and build your industry up. You had a credit system which was subservient to you. So the Kairetsu system in Japan in particular meant that the banks were there to serve the industrial wing and provide the finance for them. So they were debt finance, but it was sort of friendly, cooperative debt finance as part of a consortium rather than parasitic stuff as we tend to get in Australia. And they were building up the technology level. They really wanted to emulate and they were looking up to what they thought they could do with what America had done. So that is an attitude of internal construction and belief in innovators, and also putting those innovators under pressure so that they had to continue innovating or they'd lose out to foreign competition. So first of all, the major lesson is get rid of your level of private debt and have a boom again if you do that, first of all. And then build up on your strengths right now. And again, that Atlas of Economic Complexity does very well as saying, given your current pattern, here's the most successful way to bring combinations of new industries forward that can actually give you technological strength over time.
So you mentioned that the bubbles deflated a bit from the perspective of the UK and America, but we're still sitting on the largest one from America's, from Australia's perspective.
Yeah.
Now, America had its subprime crisis.
Yeah.
Where do you think the loans that are issued over here, what is that? Could you identify as the area and what it is?
The main thing is it's the basic dynamics are always the same. It's just that with demand being the sum of existing money turning over plus new debt, when you start reaching a peak level of debt, new debt becomes zero and your credit-based demand disappears. That's the underlying mechanism. But they've all got their own little twist to it. So the Americans kept that credit going by the subprime market. We've kept it going with zero interest loans, zero principal repayment loans, interest-only loans.
Yeah.
So when you get to the point where either banks are unwilling to extend them anymore, or people taking them out are realising, hell, property prices have turned in the other direction because that demand turnover has occurred. I'm not making any money out of this, and I've got this interest service I'm paying, and the capital value is falling. What's a sensible move for me is to sell the property.
Yeah.
Then that's most likely to be the fragility. I also hear not all the banks, but I hear some of the local financiers are operating with their asset to equity ratios in the hundreds.
Yeah.
So we could easily see an unexpected financial institution collapse because a bank with negative equity, all it takes is asset prices to fall. Assets fall, liabilities remain at the same value, equity becomes negative, they're suddenly up shit creek and they fall over. And things like Northern Rock's collapse in the UK were indicative of that. So I think we can potentially have a similar thing here. Also, because we're relying so much upon foreign buying to keep the price levels high, and you mentioned China putting capital controls in and being more stringent about them. A lot of what we think is money coming out directly from China apparently ends up being money being borrowed in Hong Kong and used to buy over here by Chinese nationals. Now, if one of the Hong Kong banks falls over, that could be enough to cut out the demand locally and force liquidation sales here. So there's a couple of potential avenues for a crunch to hit.
When I look at like the comment sections nowadays, you get the feeling that there's very few property investors there, but there's a lot of these people now that are like, come on, be done with it. Let this crash happen. I'm really getting sick of this. I've saved the money. I've sold the house. Do you sympathise with these
Absolutely,
people?
because when you had this, what we've had is an increase in the cost of housing relative to income. As that happens, the age at which somebody's able to save enough to get a deposit continues rising. So consequently, you've got people who thought they might, by the time they get back in my generation, I could have easily, in that sense, it's a social mistake by me, I could have easily had enough money saved by the age of 25 to get a deposit to buy a property. And lots of my cohort did that, obviously. It was easy to get there. And like at the age of 25, you'd be a house owner. Then at the age of 30, then the age of 35. Now it's becoming 40. And people are looking and thinking, I've been saving all my effing life and I still haven't got enough. That frustration starts to rise. And finally, you get a political groundswell, which is against the property bubble. So I'm delighted to see it happening. Just Australia's continued, Australian politicians have maintained that trend towards the stage where you're going to be 65 before you're going to get enough deposit to buy a house, and then the bank won't lend to you because you're too old.
Yeah.
So it is all, it's encouraging a parasitic financial system, which only works as long as the parasite continues growing. And as Michael Hudson put it, this is a parasite that kills the host.
Yeah. Now, everyone seems to be quite on these guided years of the end of 2017, 2018. There's going to be the crisis, the next GFC event. Could you isolate a period of time or give a time frame?
I isolated about between 9 and 16 countries that have a level of private debt and a level of credit as well, which is showing growth in private debt, that is so high that they're dependent upon that credit continuing indefinitely, which means they're dependent upon the level of private debt rising compared to income indefinitely, and it's not going to happen. So they're going to fall over. So the prime ones obviously was China. In terms of size of countries, China, I think Canada next, South Korea, then Australia, Belgium, Switzerland, Sweden, Norway. It came to about 16 between 9 and 16 countries, which could be in that danger zone. And they won't all fall over at once, but collectively they're equivalent to about the size of the American economy. And of course, when they fall over, then that will have follow-on effects in terms of credit-based demand for the other countries in the world, which I call the walking dead of debt, the UK, the USA, et cetera, which are in the aftermath to a financial crisis, which haven't delevered sufficiently to have a new boom. They're going to be bumping up and down like Japan has been doing for the last quarter century. So I saw that happening between 2017 and 2020, because you just can't continue those trends indefinitely. One of the dangers, of course, is Keynes' old statement that the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent also applies to bank credit creation. That can go on longer than you think is possible. And that certainly has been the case for me in the Australian situation. And I think there's still some headroom for them to get away with it, to push it down the train a bit further. But I can't see them getting past 2020. So my overall deadline would say, okay, it's got to be by 2020 that we have the next GFC. It won't be in the countries that had the last GFC, but once it happens, the vast majority of the world's economies are going to be what I call the walking dead of debt, and then we have to wake up to ourselves and do something about it.
Okay. Now, With Australia, do you see Australia having the independent crisis by itself, or do you think there's going to be the trigger event from China first?
Oh, by itself, it's got its own, it's well and truly fulfilled the criteria itself, but it could also be hit by China because when China's credit bubble is clearly ending, but again, the government could push and encourage lending back to the private sector once more. The Chinese can also go across to state-based spending as they're doing on a grand scale. High-speed rail being built, pollution control, etc., etc. They can generate that monetary demand. So they've got a potential to flip from one to the other, but they still will have a credit crunch, and that will have an impact on our exports, and that will feed through to us. And we might also find a property market effect if people in China find that they can't service their debts in China, because despite the fact that the money's been lent by a state-based system, it's still lending to private individuals. The private individuals are not going to be bailed out by the state. So they're going to have to potentially go bankrupt. If they have assets, they might want to liquidate somewhere. They're going to liquidate what they think is the broadest market. On that basis, they might think Australia's a good market to sell some property in. And suddenly you get a wave of selling coming in that way. So there's all sorts of potential triggers. But we've done enough to get it on our own. We don't need the help of anybody else to stuff up.
So there's everyone talks about this bond bear market event. Now, I know that countries are like complicit in quantitative easing as well at this moment, so they're kind of avoiding that crash by using those methods.
Yeah.
Is there a point where QE cannot be used anymore, and the actual
not when you've got this is actually again I'm pleased to see the Bank of England's come out with not quite a paper yet, but a web page statement saying that the central banks are the only banks that can operate with negative equity. Now, if you operate with negative equity as a bank, there's no limitation to how long you can create money for. So the central banks can keep on doing QE for as long as they like. My real point about QE is that they can't not do it, because what they've done, firstly, they falsely believe that by increasing reserves at banks there'd be more lending. That doesn't work. It simply violates the laws of accounting, which some of the banks have finally started to realise. That's the Bank of England, Norway, and the Bundesbank. But what they've also done is inflate asset prices that way, because when they've bought bonds off private financial institutions and driven down interest rates and driven bond prices up, it's also given those institutions cash, which they want to go and buy income-earning assets, so they buy shares. That's driven up share prices, and when they bought the shares, that's given the share owners profits that they've used to buy property. So it's caused these dual bubbles. But if they try to buy those shares back, so what they're going to do is then say, okay, we want to sell these bonds back to you again, which you've got to give us cash. Then you've got to liquidate the assets. So you've got opposite effect on the asset markets. As soon as that happens, there'll be a crash in the asset markets, and the central banks will go back to QE again.
Yeah. So in terms of what you're doing right now, so you're currently university professor at Kingston University, is that right? Are you going to continue that, or okay? So
no. What screwed me in Australia was the government believing that they wanted to make university education into a marketplace. Now, that's fucking crap. I'm so sick of it. I'm not going to be polite about it in any stretch of the imagination. To have a genuinely functioning market, you've got to have informed consumers. There's no such thing as an informed consumer of university degrees. High school kids who don't even know what a university is when they're leaving high school, and they just think that the higher the status, the better the organisation. So governments try to make up all these artificial measures that they think simulate a market, like in England's case, you've got the teaching excellence framework, the research excellence framework, yada, 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 all bureaucratic box-ticking exercises.
Yeah.
The result is that when they deregulated first-year intake, so it was more like a market, in Western Sydney's case, our first preferences, because we have a system of first to fifth preferences, which students fill out based on what they think their results are going to be. And back when there was quotas going into the different universities, and students would hedge their bets, and if they thought they weren't likely to get a good enough mark for New South or Sydney, they'd put Western Sydney as a first preference. Well, the first year that was deregulated in Australia's case, UWS went from 120 first preferences for economics to 16.
Yeah.
That's despite the fact that I was there and I've had a certain public profile, which the university completely failed to exploit. But that was the impact. That's what screwed my department at Western Sydney. Now, when I got to the UK, what had happened? Exactly the same stupid policy had been borrowed just before I arrived. So when I arrived at Kingston, it had roughly 22,000 students, and now has 15,000.
Yeah.
That's mainly been hitting the first year intake. It's gone across humanities because what's happened is because everything's been fee-based now, particularly in the UK, it's financially viable for higher-ranking universities, if they're freed of any controls of numbers, to offer plenty more humanities positions because that's just bums on seats. There's no technology involved in teaching, unlike STEM subjects where it costs a certain capital investment per student. So they've poached all the students from the lower ranking, what they call post-92 universities there, and that's undermined the viability of the program at Kingston.
Right.
And I was aware of that almost when I first started. So I tried to raise the profile of the place, and I've got to, apparently I'm told one of the exams in they've got multiple university exam entrance systems over this, quite a crazy system, about as chaotic as their property system compared to Australia's. But apparently my idea is one of the questions in one of the exam sets over there. So I've penetrated to that level. But it's nothing because the students just think Oxford and Cambridge must be better than Kingston. Well, they're going to get there and find they get very religious education and neoclassical economics out of those universities. But it's too late for places like Kingston. So I've had enough. I'm going across to being so crowd-funded, and I'll do what I do with the support of the public.
And where do you see the future of education? I know this is a very broad aspect, but do you see it becoming more of an online sort of where you go online and speak to people and stuff? Or
Online is a useful facility, but there's nothing like being intensely involved with somebody who actually knows their stuff and being taught it well. So what I want to do, I'm trying to build this up, and this is largely potentially with a combination in Ecuador as it happens. So I've got good links with the Ecuadorian government and education system, and there's Latin America has a thing called Flaxo, which is a pan-continental education system for humanities, and one of the centres that is based in Ecuador. So what I'm hoping is to build an online system with Patreon backing, which is where I need a lot more than I'm getting at the moment, but hopefully it'll start getting there. Build an online system for education and economics, but include with that a 1-month residential master's program, preferably in Ecuador, for several reasons. One, because it's got continuity. There's plenty of countries behind it, so it won't be serving just to politics in one. It's designed to train their bureaucrats and their politicians, so it's got a solid basis to it. And Ecuador's cheaper than London, so it'd be possible to afford a month over there and get some serious hands-on education as well. But a combination of the two. And really, universities have been so badly damaged by neoliberalism that I think a lot of the best thought's going to be happening off university campuses rather than on it.
And from the perspective of a student, so they're really getting themselves into a heavy amount of debt with potentially no job prospects, and they just get this piece of paper at the end. Like, do you think there should be more of a connection between the business world and education in that sense to get in there?
It's a fallacy to regard universities as either a business or a government institution. There's something independent. They always have been. The real history of universities emanates from monasteries, where you had scholastic. Now we call them scholastics for a reason. Scholastic individuals who would read and research and learn and teach for the sake of learning and research and teaching, and attempting to corporatize it at one extreme or bureaucratize it at the other undermines that particular sheer curiosity basis, which is part of what makes education worthwhile. It's where our learning has come from in many ways. So we have to get to the stage where we develop something like what they had in the Middle Ages, where they were places of learning for the sake of learning, not for learning for a business or learning for management.
Yeah, and the interesting thing with you is that you almost come across as an engineering economist.
That's exactly
somebody who's straddling two
that is
sort
exactly
of sectors.
When I went to university, my first preference as what I wanted to do at university was engineering and economics. It didn't exist, of course.
Right. Yeah. So, in some ways, it's like that you should have like a bias subject kind of education where you're trying to learn two different segments. Could be completely unrelated, but once you put them together, they synergize, and there's where the ideas flourish.
Yeah. And again, that's the idea of cross-fertilization, which universities should be the place that develops that. But there's a siloisation that goes on as well, and that's actually amplified by the journal ranking systems too. Because when you do cross-disciplinary work, you don't get published in the so-called top journals. And I've ignored all that successfully, fortunately.
So I understand that you've got your Patreon campaign, and
Yep.
you've been working on that in terms of bringing on more education. Is there? I noticed that with Patreon, you can add, like, once you get to certain budgets, you can go. You've got like these amazing things that you can potentially do. Like, if you gather more and more traction, where do you see yourself in the future?
Well, what I want to be able to do, first of all, is survive financially to do what I'm doing and do it in the UK, because that's by far the best basis for developing new ideas. The UK, one thing of the UK, great credit for, they're willing to entertain ideas they don't necessarily agree with. So you consequently get listened to in avenues that never happens in Australia, and certainly wouldn't happen in America or Europe. So the UK really has got it's important for me to be there. Then I want to continue getting the money to develop Minsky further, because Minsky has only had quite $250,000 of development time. There's a huge amount I want to do with that software package to extend it, to make it easier for people to learn as well. Then I want to start bringing on my own staff so that I can extend the calibre of the research I'm doing in both data analysis and teaching. I want to build that online education facility, which would take myself plus 3 or 4 other staff. So that's the overall intention, to get to the stage where I've got sufficient revenue to be a think tank that is not beholden to private interests. Yep. And at the moment, I'm sort of halfway to covering my own salary, which is a good start. As of next month, I'm on 1/4 pay at Kingston. Right. As 1 year after that, I'm going to retire from Kingston, so I need to cover that. I'm just hoping I get to the stage where I can certainly I keep my programmer Russell Standish coding full-time and pushing Minsky's capabilities further, but that's looking like it's about a year or 2 away before I get to that level.
Are you to come back to Australia
permanently?
Yeah.
I could, but like Australia, my family and a lot of my friends are here, so that matters. But it is out of the way. It is, I'm going back. For example, I get back to the UK on the 3rd. I'm going to Germany on the 6th to teach a master's program over there for a week. And then I'm going to the launch of the Polish translation of Debunking Economics and a relaunch of the French translation of Debunking Economics, all of which I can do in a 1 or 2 hour plane ride or flight. So to be removed from that, I could probably get more long-term work done back in Australia. That's one temptation of being back here. Yeah. But overall, I think it's for the next 5 years, it has to be Europe.
Europe. Okay. And so I want to end us on a quote, because we usually do this. So George Orwell said, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth will be a revolutionary act." Does liberty need to go through revolutions like a cyclical market does?
I think that's... you essentially need rebels. I mean, the reason humanity's been so powerful as a species is we share the same delusions. You can't share the same delusions when you don't have a language and a culture and philosophy. So we can share the delusion you and I can kill a lion. Now, individually, of course, we can't. Collectively, we can. So that's very, very powerful. But somebody can point out, hang on, people, keep on killing all the lions. What's going to happen to the ecosystem of the area we're in? Yeah. And the rebels are right. You get rid of the lions, and obviously the whole damn scene changes, and you no longer have a viable world. But the rebels get shouted down by the mob. So you do need the capacity for being rebels. And unfortunately, as well as humanity encouraging its power by collective action, it undermines it in the same way. And by collective action, I mean belief in the same philosophy, whether that's Marxist or Austrian. So you need your rebels. But unfortunately, that ends up being a dialectical process.
Yeah. We'll just throw in a couple of questions at the end. But do you see Australia as being a bit of a nanny state?
It's not a nanny state. It's a warden state. This is one of everybody who knows me gets this anecdote, so I'll put it on. I haven't actually done it live, but I had the weird experience when I was in my early 20s of, by accident, hosting the most famous man I'd met at the time, who was a guy called Peter Ustinov. And I know most of people watching this podcast wouldn't know who he is, but I suggest you look at Dr. Zhivago or Casablanca, and you'll see him acting, and then won't particularly stand out to you. But he was this brilliant Russian emigre family humorist, magnificent speaker, brilliant humorist with the capacity to take off other people, mimic like you wouldn't believe. And he was famous for UNICEF. So the background story I can leave out, but he turns up in my office one day, and I'm bracing myself to say, all the sort of obsequious stuff you say to somebody who's the most famous person you've ever met. What I actually said was, what on earth happened? Because this huge hulk of a man just collapsed in the chair next to me and just said, I've had the worst taxi ride of my life. And I thought, this is before the expressway linking Sydney Airport to the city existed. So I thought he was driven at reckless speed along a Reardon Street. No, it turned out he hopped in the back of the car and the driver took one look at him. This is Ustinov now saying, and saw I was white and launched into the most revolting racist diatribe I've ever heard in my life, talking about chinks and eye ties and wogs and slinks and how he has apartments out the west that he rents out to them. He'll go inside and smash up their television sets. Awful stuff. And I said, what did you do? And he said, I was just totally horrified. And he looked in the rear vision mirror and he saw that I didn't agree with him. He said his whole demeanour changed and he suddenly snarled. And Ustinov had never been in Australia before. And he did better than I can do. He took off an Australian accent. He said, I suppose you don't give a fuck what I think. I suppose you reckon all us Australians are descended from fucking convicts.
Yeah.
And Ustinov said, on the contrary, my dear man, I'm convinced you're descended from one of the warders. So rather than the nannies, we get the warders in control. And they tell the prisoners what to do. And the warders have got less brains than the bloody prisoners have. So the warders have taken over the country again. It's about time the convicts led a revolt.
Thank you, Steve. One other thing I just wanted to mention: we've gone into music before in the past. I've recently discovered another band. I just want to see if you've heard of them before. Spy versus Spy. Have you heard of them?
Yeah, I remember that was based. There was a wonderful Mad cartoon, which people should take a look at. America once was capable of satire and humour, and there was the whole thing called the Mad magazine with this Alfred E. Newman character on the cover, who's sort of teeth coming out all of the wrong sort of angles. And they even sent up Donald Trump.
Yeah.
But one of their little characters is spy versus spy, a white spy and a black spy, a white, a guy dressed all in white and a guy dressed all in black. Yeah. And they're always trying to do each other in. And the band Spy versus Spy was based on a reference to that. I honestly can't remember their music, but I know I enjoyed it.
Oh, really? Yeah. Well, I've recently discovered them. There was, and there's so many little connections in terms of what they. I think they were a little bit more sort of behind like the workers and stuff like that. And there was a song like Don't Break It Down, where they're like talking about smashing down houses. I'm not sure what that was to do with, but could have been more in relation to like council housing and things like that. Yeah. And then there was another song that was really good about really like the nanny state of Australia, where it says plastic cards and credit cards, and they're talking about really good like lyrics as well, like for a political band. Yeah. Like way ahead of what I would hear in the UK, I would say, in a lot of terms. And they're musically good as well.
They actually want to interview somebody who knows a lot about that stuff. As a guy I used to teach at high school, who's now associate professor of history at Monash University, called Tony Moore. Yeah. And Tony specialised in the whole rebel side of Australia, from base convict rebels coming out. A huge part of the convict force out here was Irish rebels being pushed overseas as an alternative to being executed back in Ireland for rebelling against the English. Yeah. But also the whole bohemian tradition that was focused on music, pretty much in inner city Sydney and Melbourne. And Tony knows those bands like the back of his hand. So have a good talk to him about where the politics came from. He said dancing with empty pockets and staring at the stars while lying in the gutter were some of the little references he made to the nature of those bands.
Well, thank you, Steve. I know that you're over here in Australia. How much longer are you over here for?
Just another week.
Just another week, so I don't even know if I'm going to be able to get it uploaded in time. But is there anything else that you
no,
want to
pretty
add
much
to that?
exhaust me for that. Yeah,
well, thank you very much for your time.
Welcome.
Thank you.